So we're now going to talk to Ruth Barrett. Ruth Barrett is the editor of Female Erasure, which was published in 2016. And it's this book here. It's very, very big. There's a lot of pages in it. Now, many of you will have already read it. 551 pages, and it's got sort of 30 or 40 different pieces by different women. It's incredibly brilliant. It's an overview from 2015, but I guess, Ruth, you wrote it or edited it in 2015. So, Ruth, the first question I have: what made you write? What got you to write or edit Female Erasure?
The thing about how I got interested in needing or felt compelled to do this is because I've been dealing with this issue since the late 1980s. This is not a new issue. I am part of a spiritual tradition that is female-centered and female-only. It's a branch of Wiccan religion, which is feminist witchcraft, that came out of second-wave feminism. And our tradition has always been in women only, and it came out of second wave feminism when women began to gather in CR groups, in consciousness raising groups, and there was a lot of research happening around women's history that had been, of course, not taught to any of us, our long history of what happened before patriarchy actually existed. And so there were a lot of social movements that converged, including the women's liberation movement, what was called the gay liberation movement, the ecology movement. Many social movements that converged that gave rise to this. The truth is, women have always gathered separately from males for specific rights around our bodies. I mean, that's always been long before there was a feminist movement. So what happened was there was a revival in the late 1960s into the early 1970s where it had a new context to emerge, and that it was not only to be I want to say a solution to female self-hatred and body hatred, but also to heal from the context in which we live, which is patriarchy. It was a convergence of those things that were the goals of this. And we call this tradition Dianic after the Roman goddess Diana, but her Artemis is really the Greek goddess who preceded Diana, is really more the name giver. And it has to do with female sovereignty. So I've been involved with feminism and its impact and how we can empower and heal for myself about 45 years. And the issue came to my door because we've always had to deal with, from the very beginning, men who were upset with us because we were female only. So dealing with that has always been from the beginning for 50 years this year. We're celebrating 50 years this year.
So Ruth, did you see an increasing number of men saying they were women over the last, say, 20 years? Did it really start impacting on your activities?
Thank you. Yes, it started I think it was in the very early 90s where it really started. It started, there was one man who wanted to take one of my classes, and this was, definitely had done the breasts, the nails, all the things. And at that time, I let him into one class, one beginning class, and it was, really early on. I knew this was a strange person. I had a feeling about it, but we weren't as, I would know it in 1 second now, okay? But at the time, it was very awkward. And I told him that I could no longer be his teacher because because he was a guy. And basically, the biggest, I guess, wake up thing for me was that he told me literally that he was a better woman than me because he had chosen to be a woman, and I was born this way.
Wow, that's so terrible. And
I mean, yeah.
yeah, I mean that's awful. And you were experiencing it very clearly quite a long time ago. What's what what made you call the book Female Erasure? Because I remember when I got it, I thought, well, that's a bit extreme. I don't know if they're really going to try to actually erase females. And this was 2016 or whatever. But the every year that goes past, I think it's so right, the title. But
Well,
what were you
yes.
thinking with the title?
I struggled with what to call the book. I met with a couple of women who had doctorates, one in religion and one in women's studies. And we had this discussion actually at a Parliament for the World's Religions back in 2015. And because originally I was going to call it something else that was not exactly, pressing the button. And there are people who have different ideas about, go for something more positive as opposed to something that has that. And I realized that this was what it was. It was what it was. And so I decided to just name it. And because it was, at the time I put this together, there was not, I was really trying to find women who would speak out from many different perspectives. It was very challenging. Those early interviews and early articles that were in the book, I mean, I had women who knew they would be fired if they used their real names. There were doctors and psychologists, and now, of course, it's what has happened since the publication of that book, and it was published actually in 2016. It's now there's a lot more out there, which is wonderful. I mean, it really truly has changed in that regard.
I must say, though, that I think whilst there is a lot out there, this is still, I mean, it stands the test of time. There's a lot of very core ideas in there, and there's articles from some of the important feminists, I think. And so definitely for women who haven't read it, I would recommend it is definitely worth still reading, getting now, even though it is a few years old. It's sort of, it hits the nail on the head. But what do you think? Did you think it was going to get this bad? Did you think in the last 5 years the things would change so quickly and so far? Or has it been a surprise to you?
It's not been a surprise at all. I wish I could say I'm surprised. I'm horrified. Um, Clearly, I'm horrified, and I think that the the non-thinking to sign on to this is the most terrifying part. And of course, we're seeing these extremes on the far right and on the far left. And so I think when we talk about it as cult mentality, I believe that's true. And I think that the way that that has been successful, greatly successful, is because of the language. And I know a lot of us have talked about this, and I've certainly written about it, even in Female Erasure. And that's the concept of framing. The language that we use actually reveals the worldview of the speaker. And so we cannot use the language of the transgender lobby and their activists. When we do that, we enter their frame. We enter their world, and we need to use our language and stick to our language that reflects our point of view.
Yeah. And so I know some have spoken about this, but can you give us a couple of examples of that?
Well, exactly, like trans women, using trans-identified males is our frame. Theirs places them a male in the category of woman.
Yeah. I
So
mean, I
we
quite like the way saying, if you say it's men who identify, so you put men first, so you hear the word men, that's really clear then, and it keeps yeah, okay, so that's a really good thing to use our language.
Yes, and I do want to recommend the work of George Lakoff. If you don't know about the work of George Lakoff, this is he's a cognitive scientist and linguist, and he's written a lot about how language is used to literally manipulate. I mean, this is why we're in this situation on so many levels. And one of the books he wrote called The Political Mind, and it was written before this issue, the trans issue is happening. But it literally, how you think changes how the brain matter. I'm talking about physicalizing. And so how to recognize the power of the words we choose to use cannot be understated.
Yeah.
And
And so, yeah, Ruth, another thing, because you've thought about this and you had the foresight to say female erasure and call your book that, what do you think's going to happen next? Could you give us share some of your ideas about what you think is going to happen in the next, say, 5 years, even if
well,
it's really bad?
yes,
Well, bad.
well, one thing I have to remind myself, and I'll remind all of us, is that women's rights have never been in a straight line. There's been progress, and then there's been backlash. There's been progress and backlash. And you can look at this through history and culturally. And so it gives me hope that even though right now it's really, really bad, it's not looking like, no one, anyone wants to listen to us. There are people who are listening to us, and there are more of us gathered. We have to look for the wins in the midst of the horror of this. We have to look also for the wins. And so I think that there will absolutely be a cycle of waking up. Unfortunately, there's a lot of collateral damage to our children and to our rights as women, to our sovereignty. And I also believe that it will cycle through. And I think that as the lawsuits begin with the medical establishment, with treating men as though they are female people biologically, just like we know that it wasn't until the 1990s in the United States that there were studies on women in women's health, actually on the female body, and the institutes of health all show sex matters.
Yeah.
Sex matters.
Thank you so much. And Ruth, we've just only got time for one more sort of question. What I'd be really interested in knowing is, what do you think we should do next? What
Okay.
should we do
Well,
about
the main thing is we need to keep speaking out. And I do want to mention one thing that I just did, and it may interest some of you to do. I watched the White House correspondent, the press briefings that are happening on television, and I just realized I could write to the White House Correspondents Association, and I did, and I told them to ask those questions, and I brought the WHRC declaration, and I sent it. I gave them the contact. I sent them that information. I think if more of us did that and have the reporters ask the questions of the press gal, and it's the White House, WHCA.press/contact. and that's White House Correspondents Association. You could have a reporter maybe ask the questions, and that's what I did about the Equality Act. And I basically,
That's great. And we can, if we had questions, we can ask journalists to ask them for us.
exactly, it just was like one of those duh moments, and that's what I've done. And so, in other words, would the Biden administration consider a win-win solution that protects both natal females, and I put and transgender, by including sex as a category for protections under the law? The last thing I want to mention too is I am actually helping a young woman named Elizabeth Miller publish a new anthology, and it's going to be coming out, I think, in March. It's called Spinning and Weaving: Radical Feminism for the 21st Century.